Hi again. Want to do two things in the second part of this mini lecture. The first is actually to go back to the PowerPoint that I sent you because I only went through two pictures there and there are a lot more that I think will give you more of a visual reference to what I'm talking about in terms of picturesque peasants and the kind of Disneyfied versions of peasant dwellings and farms that were rife in the aristocracy and the upper classes at this period, and then go on to explore what Gray means when he uses the word "the," who that person might be. In any case, if you turn back or if you pull up the PowerPoint that I sent you and move on to the third picture, what you're going to see there, another Gainsborough painting, which is a fairly highly idealized image of a woodcutter or maybe just someone who's gathering deadfalls. They were called faggots, just the limbs that had fallen from the trees. That looks more like what he has got in his arms. And then a young milkmaid. You will see these kinds of pairings a lot when people are working in the genre of what I'm calling picturesque peasants. In the distance, you'll see a guy plowing, and then up on the hill, maybe a little donkey and something else going on. And that gnarled tree that you see, that the woodman and the milkmaid are in front of, is really almost kind of a signature characteristic of picturesque landscape when it becomes more rusticated, when it becomes not what Pope is talking about in terms of the beautifully manicured Claudian landscape gardens of the aristocracy and the upper landed gentry, but a more kind of rusticated rural idea of the picturesque. If you move down to the next picture, what you're going to see is a highly idealized little peasant girl with a puppy and a broken urn. She has ragged clothes, but they're kind of picturesque ragged clothes. She seems pretty clean. She's a little bit wistful, but again, you can see, I think, this idealization that's taking place. Moving to the next picture. This is a painting, I think it's by George Morland, of workers. Clearly, if they are peasants, they are well-to-do peasants. They're very well dressed. They have pets. They have some kind of booze that the guy is squirting into a, looks like a pitcher. Not sure what he's going to do to that, but at least two dogs. I don't know, and some big loaf of bread. They're having lunch. Again, does not look like a bad life to have. I'm sure there were some peasants that looked like this, but once again, I do not think it is representative. In any case, this ideal of peasant life, of this kind of perfect peasant life, became so attractive to the upper classes that people actually began to build rusticated farmhouses, so that, or rusticated cabins, or rusticated thatched cottages that they could then dress up like, so they could dress up like peasants, only with very finely wrought clothes, and go out and pretend to be peasants. And probably the most egregious example of this is up next. This is the Ferme Ornée at Versailles in France that Marie Antoinette had built for her. Looks pretty cool. Actually, does kind of look like someplace from Disneyland. Meant to look kind of old and battered, but in fact quite new and comfortable. And she and her maids of honor would dress up like milkmaids, except in silk milkmaid clothes, and go out, and they had animals there, and they might, you know, kind of pretend to touch the udder of a cow or something, but then they actually had other people that did the milking for them. Another example of the Ferme Ornée at Versailles, even got a live goat. But again, I mean, take a look at that building. It's built to look like that. Now, obviously, these days it's well over 200 years old, but when it was built, it was brand new, and it was built to look like that. So you know what I'm talking about here. It's kind of a replication of the past, but in a more comfortable way, so that the upper classes can go out and pretend to be picturesque peasants. This doesn't mean they didn't really know what was going on, and I think a good example of this, though very few people painted realistic paintings or even did realistic drawings of the peasantry. But Gainsborough, in another version of the cottage door, actually takes a shot at getting a little closer to reality. And so if you go to your next picture, what you're going to see is the same rustic cottage, thatch roof, the whole deal. But you'll notice two of the kids are fighting. Another one looks like maybe crying or begging. Not nearly as a calm scene. The dog, I don't know what it's doing. I guess it's getting excited because the kids are fighting. The women still look pretty good, still look a bit like Drury Lane actresses, but what you finally see in here is an actual peasant laborer, in this case possibly the dad, and what he's doing is carrying a very large and a heavy load of faggots again. And the reason that they collected these off the ground is because peasants, in most cases, were not allowed to cut down trees. The trees belonged to the estate owner, not to the peasant. So the way you warmed your house, if you were lucky enough to have a wood nearby that had a lot of deadfalls in it, is you go and pick up these deadfalls and carry them home. And that is what you had to warm you on the cold English nights. So this guy actually looks like he's really working for once. Doesn't look like that much fun. Next one, again, just a slight bit more realistic, it seems to me. It does kind of have a Clodian design, rusticated Clodian design. You can see the kind of, dark flats on the side and then the light mass carrying you through. But it's just people getting onto a rustic, I don't know what you'd call it, not really a carriage, a wagon that's full of hay and stuff. They're kind of crowded on there. Doesn't look bad, doesn't look great, just a little bit closer to reality. Now this final example I'm going to show you is pretty much anachronistic. That is to say, it's not necessarily, the pictures are not from the time we're talking about, because two of them are photographs, and photography has not yet been invented, clearly, by the middle of the 18th century. It'll be almost another 100 years, at least 75 years. You can go see the world's first photograph if you want to. It's in the HRC at the University of Texas at Austin. So once that opens up again, maybe it is, you can go look at the world's first photograph, which I think dates from the late 1830s, but I'm not quite sure. In any case, peasant girls again. Peasant girls were peasant children were a favorite subject. So you see Gainsborough's little girl that we saw before, and then the next picture is another little girl in rags. Her hair is similar, but not quite so disheveled. It's almost as if she were posed to replicate in reverse. Then of course it might be in reverse because it is a photograph. Depended how they printed it. I'm not sure if this is a daguerreotype or an ambrotype or what it is. It would depend on what kind of a photograph it is. But she somehow doesn't look authentically peasant, nor does the little girl who's supposed to be a peasant. They both are kind of upscale peasants. Well, I can tell you about the little girl in the middle because we know exactly who she is. Her name is Alice Pleasance Liddell, spelled Liddell. Her father was the dean of Christ Church Cathedral at Oxford, the cathedral attached to the biggest college at Oxford, Christ Church. The Great Hall in Harry Potter is a CGI version of the Christ Church Hall. And so she was way up the social ladder. maybe not aristocracy, but her drawing master, for example, was John Ruskin, the famous critic and poet. So she ran in high circles. You'll notice her first name is Alice. That's interesting, and because the person who took the photograph was a don, that is to say a tutor in Christ Church at that time. He tutored mathematics. His name was Charles Dodson, but he would later write a book you probably know, or books you probably know something about, under the name of Lewis Carroll. And the title of the most famous one of these is Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. And that's Alice, right there. That's the real Alice, Alice Pleasant's Little. Long story behind how he tells his tale to them when they're rowing up the river to Godstow in Oxford. I'm not going to go into it here, but this is a upscale little girl being dressed up like a peasant. Last picture from the Victorian era of a real peasant girl. And she's got a rabbit, not a dog. But she doesn't look happy. Her clothes, while not ripped, are ill-fitting. They're not picturesque. They're just kind of ugly. Her hair, a little bit disheveled, just like Gainsborough's peasant girl, but her expression says it all. So this is the contrast that I want you to keep in mind when you're reading these poems and seeing these pictures of these idealized peasants. This is not necessarily what the peasantry actually looked like in general. Now, you're probably wondering, well, didn't anybody write about the real ones? Didn't anybody paint the real ones? As I said, very few paintings. I could show you a couple, or at least one, but I haven't got it out right now, so no big deal. I may throw it in later when you do the deserted village. But in terms of poetry, there was a poet named George Crabbe, great last name for him, who in fact had actually been raised in a rural community, and he writes a series of scathing poems about what life is really like as a peasant in a small village. Jane Austen really liked him as a poet because she thought he told the truth about what life was really like there. I could read to you again a few lines from Crabbe, but I've already gone on longer than I want to with these pictures. We need to get back to thee, but maybe again when we do Goldsmith, I'll just in one of my posts put in the first paragraph of one of Crabbe's poems, and you can see what I'm talking about. Okay, so much for the pictures. Let's now go back to the poem. So you probably thought long and hard. Maybe you have thought long and hard about thee, who thee is, and the answer is there is no answer. There are two major schools of thought. I'll give you both of them, and I think they're equally interesting, and you can make up your mind which you think it is. Clearly, there now are two people in some way, shape, or form present where there used to only be one. And very soon there'll actually be three. Whether these are real or imagined, again, that's part of the problem. So, solution number one. The poet up to line 92 is actually is an invention, is a persona created by Gray. It's not Gray writing this poem, it is this persona, this character, writing the poem. And then at this point, there's a shift in perspective, and Gray, as a third-person authorial voiceover poet, comes in and actually addresses the poet, and we'll find out more about that poet later, who has been writing this poem. So he says, "For thee, who mindful of the unhonored dead, dost in these lines their artless tale relate." So you, the person I made up, who's talking about the unhonored dead and their lives. And then he addresses him and says, "If chance by lonely contemplation led, some kindred spirit shall inquire thy fate." What? Now another person has walked into the scene. So what Gray seems to be imagining is that he's talking to the poet who wrote the first 92 lines, and he is saying to that person, what if sometime down the line, a person who is a whole lot like you happens to be here in the graveyard? That makes it a little bit ominous, and asks about you. Well, how could he ask about him? Only if he were dead, okay? Inquire thy fate. Who is this guy who's buried here? And then a fourth character drops in. Haply some hoary-headed swain may say. Happily meaning luckily, fortunately. This some hoary-headed meaning gray hair. An old peasant will be standing nearby and will be able to tell this person who's asking, who is a lot like you because he's a like spirit and therefore interested in dead peasants, what happened to you. And then he goes into the story of the poet who is buried now in the present, I guess, in this graveyard. Okay, the other way to think about it is to think that Gray is not necessarily talking to himself, but in a way is, that is to say, or maybe not Gray, but whatever poet persona is simply imagining the future himself. So it's not exactly like Gollum, like this, but he's imagining his own future. And so the same setup would apply, except that it would not be Gray stepping back from this character, but the character actually going into a mode of self-reflection and talking about himself in the third person as if he were another person. Does that make sense? It's a little confusing, isn't it? In any case, so we have this other whole poet character who we're going to find out about, some person who's very like him in being interested in dead poets, has been hanging around years later in the graveyard, happens to see his grave, wants to ask somebody about it, and luckily there's an old peasant there who was around when this dead poet was around being a poet, who can tell him the story. So we get to find out about this guy. And here's the story. I won't read it all, just the parts that seem to me to be the most important. After we have seen him at the peep of dawn, brushing with hasty steps the dews away to meet the sun upon the upland lawn. Okay, he'd get up early and start to wander around. But presumably getting tired after doing that for a little while, there at the foot of yonder nodding beech that wreathes its fantastic roots so high, his listless length at noontide would he stretch and pour upon the brook that babbles by. So he would wander early in the morning, aimlessly through the woods, get down by a babbling brook, lay down, not really zonk out, but just kind of meditate, I guess, on the brook, babbling by. And now the swain continues, hard by yon wood, now smiling as in scorn, muttering his wayward fancies he would rove, now drooping, woeful wan, like one forlorn or crazed with care or crossed in hopeless love. Uh-oh, this guy's clearly a troubled poet. He's either lost his love or there's something that is kind of possessing him, and he's talking to himself, and he's sad, and he's wandering through, and he's clearly a soulful type who is in some kind of pain. So what kind of poet is that? It's a sensibility poet. It's a pre-romantic poet. In fact, it's kind of a romantic poet. It's kind of the stereotype that is at this point in literary history being built, and one that you guys probably all believe in to one degree or another, of what a poet is. Sort of too sensitive for normal life, someone who lives a lot in his and her brain, someone highly emotional, someone who, if it's a guy and you bring him home to your dad and say, look, this is my new boyfriend who I'm going to marry, and he's a poet, your dad's going to go, oh no. I love poets, but you know what I'm talking about? That's a stereotype. That stereotype had never existed until now, until the 1750s, until around the time that Gray invents this. Poets in the past had done other things. They had been diplomats. They had been ministers. They had been courtiers. They had been soldiers. They had been owners of playhouses. They had day jobs, so to speak. Pope is the first poet who ever can completely support himself without patronage as a poet. So being a poet prior to that didn't make you different, really. Didn't make you strange. Didn't make you withdrawn. Didn't make you obsessed with fantasies of your brain. By the end of the Romantic period, however, this notion of what a poet is has been kind of ingrained into the public mind, and we're going to be looking at that very closely, how that happens when we look at the Romantic poets. I would just give you one person I want you to think about going forward, and he is a character in Gray's other poem that we read, The Bard, and that is the Bard himself. Because the reason this happens is that poets, as we move toward Romanticism, start to think of themselves as not merely poets, but as prophets, as people who somehow have a greater understanding and access to the truth of existence than anybody else. They start to see poetry almost as a substitute religion and themselves as the prophets of that religion. Well, that immediately puts you into a different category than somebody like Wallace Stevens, who was the executive in an insurance company, or T.S. Eliot, who was a banker. Yeah? Now, the reason I picked those more modern poets is to say, yeah, not all poets are like that. A lot of poets have day jobs and do what we would consider just be normal work and then are poets as well. I'm just saying that stereotype of a poet is being constructed to a degree in this poem. So anyway, yeah, this guy's wandering around through the woods. Obviously he's literate, but the question is, where does he come from? Well, we're going to find that out in just a minute. Because in the next stanza, the swain says that one day he doesn't show up in his accustomed spots. He isn't seen wandering around muttering to himself or doing anything else. And then it ends up that he's dead. And he's carried into the graveyard. And then we have his epitaph. But the stanza just before the epitaph is really an interesting stanza, because here's what he says. The next was dirges dew in sad array, slow through the churchway path we saw him borne. Approach and read, for thou canst read, in parentheses. Wow. Isn't that the entire poem? The entire poem inside parentheses? The swain can't read. He's never been educated. He's exactly like the people that this peasant poet, who is now dead, has been talking about throughout the length of the poem, up to page 92. But the poet who just died is, in fact, since he's being buried in the village church by people who know him, one of those peasants who manages to escape. Did he go to university? How did he learn to read? How did he learn to turn into a poet? And he has come back to the village and wandered around, bumping into trees and laying by the brook, probably out of some kind of despair that we don't know about, until he dies. So he is one who has gone away and maybe felt the celestial fire, but it hasn't done him a whole lot of good, because he is now dead and back in the graveyard of the village. But more than that, and this is not my insight, but it's a great insight, it's almost as if those parentheses are like a grave. And inside it lies all these peasants who can't read, which is implied by the swain saying, for thou canst read, as well as one peasant who got out, came back, could read, wrote a poem, died, and is inside those little parentheses. Okay, and then the epitaph, which I don't really like, because again, it seems like a giant cop-out by Gray, because he effectively says that he did have a humble birth, but science frowned not upon it. In other words, he got to be educated. He did get to learn. science can mean a lot of things. It doesn't mean test tubes and stuff like that back in this period. He got to go somewhere, to university, who knows where. But melancholy, some kind of deep melancholy, also was part of his makeup. And then, large was his bounty and his soul sincere. Heaven did a recompenses largely send. He gave to misery all he had a tear. That's what the poet gave. He gave to misery, to the people he wrote the poem about, a tear. He gained from heaven, 'twas all he wished, a friend. Wow. See, we're back to the noiseless peasants who are lucky because they haven't ever asked for anything more. All this poet wanted from heaven was a friend. I would think he might have wanted something more, something like more quality, something like more money, something like more food. But once again, Gray does this strange thing where he seems to elevate the peasants and say if only they had education they could do so much, and at the same time he says, but they're probably happier barefoot out there working 16 hours a day because then, you know, vices and bad things don't happen to them. Highly ambiguous poem. In any case, that's Gray's Elegy. A lot of people read it, what I consider to be very simplistically, as, oh, look at this guy, he's finally looking seriously at the peasants, isn't that wonderful? I don't look at it that way at all. I see it as highly ambiguous, almost impossible to pin down. Gray consciously or unconsciously playing both ends against the middle. And I do think it's a great poem, but not necessarily for the reasons that people usually name. Okay, that's it for Gray. Let me now, however, remind you of something. We are at this point right in the middle of the 18th century. And in the 20 years spanning the time that this poem was written, the date on this poem was what, 1751, from 1750 to 1770, here are all the people who are writing and the works you have read, or snippets of the works you have read by them. Johnson. Would we read from Johnson? We read parts of Rasselas, 1759, parts of Preface to Shakespeare, 1765, right? Yeah. Burke, Sublime and the Beautiful, 1759. Yeah? Reynolds, the early discourses, right around 1770, 1768 is when they began. And then Gray. Not only that, the next person you're going to read, Oliver Goldsmith, in his poem The Deserted Village, also writes this during that period. Moreover, Johnson, late neoclassical, Reynolds, late neoclassical, Burke, moving more toward the sublime, and Goldsmith, who definitely is into the picturesque poet mode and a sensibility poet to a degree, though he also has a bit of late neoclassicism in him, are all members of the club. They're all friends. They all meet. They all drink together. They all talk. So that's why I want to call it classic and romantic. It's not classic, romantic, especially at this period. Totally mixed. And it's always mixed. It's just that the tendency is going to be toward a more romantic view as we move forward. So I